Good morning. Welcome to day 4 of the Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop. My name is Carolyn Gannett, and I'm the manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan. This morning's session is Planning Part 1. Planning is an integral part of any project, so we dedicated a whole day to the planning phase of a project. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Our first presenter today is Sarah Thacker. Sarah is a researcher with InnoTechAlberta. Some of you may have had the chance to be in Sarah's discussion group yesterday afternoon. Today, Sarah will be speaking about soil sterilants and native species and whether remediation guidelines are appropriate. Go ahead, Sarah.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for having me here today and being here to listen to my presentation. I'll just get right into it. I'll be talking about native prairie species and soil sterilants. All right, so native grasslands are complex ecosystems that are composed of a diverse array of plant and wildlife communities. And because these systems are complex, they can also be quite sensitive to disturbance. And when we're considering sensitive ecosystems like grasslands, it's important to think about how our reclamation and remediation practices may impact these systems and whether we're causing necessary or unnecessary disturbance of these systems. Evaluating the basis behind the remediation guidelines that we have in place is important. It helps us to ensure that our current environmental management practices are both protective of the environment and also adaptable to change. And it also helps us to ensure that over time we're improving on our guidelines and best management practices. In Alberta, the historical use of soil sterilants continues to cause major reclamation challenges today. And in our province, the guidelines for soil sterilants, these would be our Tier 1 remediation guidelines, were largely developed using agronomic species. And so there's some uncertainty regarding how native species and native prairie species would react to sterilants. Are they more tolerant or more sensitive than the agronomic species? And so this opens up an opportunity to look at possibly developing site-specific remedial endpoints or potential alternative guidelines for native species and soil sterilants. So I'll just go a bit into what sterilants are for those who might not know. So sterilants are essentially herbicides. They were commonly used in Alberta from the 1960s to late 1990s. And they were used to control weeds on rangelands, pipeline right-of-ways, oil and gas sites, and other industrial sites like pulp mills and sawmills. And they have three main characteristics. So sterilants are generally non-selective, which means that they will control all forms of vegetation, grasses, forbs, trees, shrubs. They also are residual, so they remain effective in the soil for longer than one growing season. And they're also persistent. So they don't break down easily in the soil and can remain there for years. So 30 and 40 years on from when these sterilants were first applied, they're still in the soil and they're still causing reclamation challenges. So sterilants are problematic because of those three main characteristics talked about, which make it difficult to deal with. They were also typically applied at very high application rates, multiple years, which means that there's a bit of these compounds in the soil. I just got a warning about my internet connection. So because there can be a buildup of these compounds, they can be a source of contamination offset, either through and very difficult to treat sterilants to guideline levels. And it's estimated that there's over 60,000 sites in Alberta that still have sterilant impacts today. Just going to close. So in 2019, InnoTechAlberta started the Soil Sterilants Program. This is a 5-year program that looks at addressing the challenges associated with soil sterilants through risk management and risk assessment, and also through looking at potential remediation technologies that are available. So it's a joint effort through InnoTech and its industry partners who fund the research, and then also there's various project service providers. There's 12 projects in the program, and each of them have a different service provider. And so the work that I'm going to talk about today falls under the Sterilants program. It's project number 9, which is the one I'm working on, native species ecotoxicity assessment. Okay, so the challenge that the ecotoxicity assessment is looking to deal with is the fact that I mentioned earlier that the soil quality guidelines that we have in Alberta are largely based on agronomic species. And we want to help address this uncertainty regarding the sensitivity of native species to soil sterilants. So the purpose of the experiment was to evaluate the toxicity of bromacil and tebuthyron to Alberta native species. Bromacil and tebuthyron are the 2 most commonly used sterilants in Alberta, and you might know them by their trade names, which are Hyvar and Spike. And from this toxicity data, we wanted to try to develop potential alternative guidelines for soil eco-contact direct guidelines, which relate to our Tier 1 guidelines in the province. Okay, so getting into the how this project was designed. So we conducted a greenhouse experiment to assess the toxicity to different native species. We followed a modified Environment Canada. Environment Canada lays out a method for testing terrestrial species when exposed to contaminants in soil. And we followed this method with a few modifications. So the modification that we made was generally these experiments are run for 3 weeks, but we chose to double this and run it for 6 weeks. And the reasoning behind this was we were using native species, and a lot of these species are much slower growing than the agronomic species typically used in these toxicity tests. And so we just wanted to make sure that we had meaningful data and also data that we could measure accurately. So if you look at the table here, this is just giving an outline of what we did. So we had 1 test soil. It was a loam sourced from within the province. It was fine textured. And we had 2 soil sterilants, bromacil and tebuthyron. And then, so basically we spiked the soil to varying concentrations of each of these sterilants, the plants in that soil. So for each sterilant, we had a negative control, which were pots that had just clean soil in it that we didn't add any sterilant to. And then for each sterilant, we had 11 concentrations of increasing concentration. So these ranged from about 0.05 milligrams per kilogram to 10 milligrams per kilogram of either bromacil or tebuthyron. So these were really low concentrations. And then we had different species that we were looking at for the 2 sterilants, just based on the information that was already available. So the species we chose to look at for bromacil were blue grama, western wheat, green needlegrass, plains rough fescue, and June grass. And for tebuthyron, we looked at blue grama, green needlegrass, northern wheat, and plains rough fescue. And I should also mention that for most of these species, we used locally adapted seed. So majority of the species, we wild collected the seed Blue grama and June grass, though, we couldn't get locally, so we did use commercial seed for those two. Okay, so then after that 6-week growth period, we measured various endpoints on these plants. So we looked at emergence, shoot length, weight. These are standard in that Environment Canada protocol I mentioned. And if you look at those pictures there, the first one on the left, top left, is showing what some of the plants looked like after we root washed them before taking length and biomass measurements. And then the bottom picture there is showing, this is actually blue grama in tebuthyron spiked soil. And the first pot is showing the negative control, where there's no sterilant, and then increasing concentrations from left to right. So you can see that there was clearly an effect of tebuthyron on those plants. Okay, so in order to assess toxicity, we take that endpoint data for each species and sterilant, and we fit regressions to the data and then develop inhibition concentrations, which give us information on toxicity. So it's a little bit confusing, so I wanted to use this example here to show you, to explain what we did. So the graph that you're looking at, this is blue grama. It's shoot length. You can see on the y-axis shoot length when exposed to tebuthyron in soil. And so the dots that you're seeing are the individual data points that we collected. And the black line is showing the regression that we fit to the data. So not surprisingly, shoot length decreased as the concentration of tebuthyron increased. And the, I should say, and the shading is showing the confidence interval for the data. So once we fit that regression, we can then assess inhibition concentrations. So the IC25 would be the concentration at which there's a 25% reduction in shoot length. And the IC50 would be the concentration at which there's a 50% reduction in shoot length. You can see those are drawn out on the graph there. Okay, so getting into the results, I'm going to use blue grama as my example again, because there was a lot of data to go through. So generally, emergence was really not impacted by sterilant concentration. Even at the highest concentrations, we did not see impact on emergence, but generally after emerging, the plants died shortly after that. In general, bromacil tended to be more toxic than tebuthyron. So if you're looking at the table I have there, and look in the IC25 column, I've highlighted 2 boxes. So you can see blue grama shoot length when exposed to bromacil. The IC25 occurred at about 0.1 milligrams per kilogram of bromacil. If you look at the blue area, for tebuthyron, the IC25 occurred at about 0.8 milligrams per kilogram tebuthyron. So this is showing us that bromacil was more toxic than tebuthyron. There generally wasn't a clear difference in how roots and shoots were impacted by the sterilants. So if you look at the IC50 column, the 2 red boxes I have highlighted there, that's shoot and root weight. And you can see there wasn't a big difference in those 2 inhibition concentrations. I should explain too, sorry, that the number in parentheses is the standard error, if you're wondering about that. And there was a species-specific effect. So blue grama was the most tolerant species that we looked at, but other species like June grass, plains rough fescue, and green needle grass tended to be the most sensitive to these sterilants. Okay, so with that toxicity data, we wanted to look at developing possible alternative guidelines for these sterilants in the province. So to develop soil quality guidelines based on the inhibition concentrations that we had determined, we worked with Millennium EMS Solutions, or MEMS. This is a company we work with a lot for various projects, and they followed CCME protocols for developing soil quality guidelines or soil eco-contact pathway guidelines, which are what are used in our Tier 1 guidelines. So to give you an idea of what they did, so the first step in developing these quality guidelines is to develop species sensitivity distributions. And MEMS looked at an array of data for this. So first, they considered a scenario with all plants and invertebrates. So this means they were looking at the new data for native species that I just talked about, but also the historical data for agronomic species and invertebrates that were used to develop the guidelines that we currently have in place. They also looked at a scenario of just using the native plants with the historical invertebrate data, and then just using the historical agronomic plants with the historical invertebrate data. And in the end, they chose to develop the potential alternative guidelines based on all the data, as it gave, the greatest whole picture of what was going on. And this graph here is just these species sensitivity distributions look like. This is bromacil on the x-axis, and then the fraction of species affected on the y. And again, you can see they've plotted the data points. The red line is a regression, and the blue line is bootstrap data. And then they're showing here with these arrows the 25th and 50th percentile. Okay, so if you look at the table that I put on this figure, this is comparing the current Tier 1 guidelines in Alberta versus these potential alternative guidelines that were developed based on this new data for native species. So you can see that the alternative guidelines that were developed are more conservative than our current Tier 1 guidelines for bromacil and tebuthyron. And this is really a function of the new data for native species, which I've been talking about today, which indicates that native species were more sensitive to these sterilants than the species that had historically been studied. I should note that there are some complexities with this data set, and these are just potential guidelines. So it is possible to look at it in different ways. You could subset the data by the native and agronomic species more selectively. So you could use just the native species for natural land uses, or just the agronomic species for agricultural land uses. So it isn't a clear thing. As well, there were experimental factors to consider. For example, the current guidelines were based on data using a different soil, and our current experiment used a different soil. So there's other factors that could also contribute to these differences. Okay, so overall, research that we completed with this ecotoxicity assessment has improved our understanding of how native species respond to soil sterilants, as there really was not much information prior to this. It does appear that native species may be more sensitive to the impact of bromacil and tebuthyron than the agronomic species and invertebrates that had been historically studied. I think that some interesting areas for future work, or to advance this further, would be to complete more toxicity testing with a greater range of native species, but also in a range of soil types to see, what the variability could be across the entire province where these sterilants would have been applied. As a side note, I also think directly comparing locally adapted versus non-local seed could be really interesting. It wasn't a focus of this study, but it would be interesting to see if we, compared locally adapted versus non-local blue grama, for example. Would there be a difference in how they tolerate these sterilants? But overall, I think that these findings are a valuable resource for decision makers regarding the management of sterilant-impacted sites. And I think it could be applicable for consideration in other provinces as well. So with that, thank you for listening today. And I do have a final slide that has some references if you're interested in checking out any of the sources that I used. So thanks.
That was great. We do have about 10 minutes for questions if the attendees want to start typing them in. I will activate the Q&A mode so we can put them up on the screen.
Oops.
And so our first question is, are soil sterilants still being used for weed control, and has industry moved away from them?
So my understanding is that for the most part, industry has moved away from using them. People are recognizing that they're very challenging to deal with after the fact. So yeah, there's a movement away from soil sterilants.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. There aren't any other questions. So then these guidelines were developed, but they haven't been adopted by regulators yet.
No, so we when we first started the experiment, we did talk to the Alberta government about what if those modifications we made would be acceptable to them, and they did say yes. So, but again, like I'd said, they're potential alternatives at this time. I don't know if they will be accepted or if we'll want more data, like I had mentioned. So it's just adding more information at this point.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. This next question is from Cameron. Any recommendations for native species to seed along old decommissioned railways that may be contaminated that have a better chance of surviving overall?
Well, from the study that we did, most of the species did not do well. We had actually done an initial test to try and we had a wider range of concentrations initially, and we did a test to narrow that down. And even after narrowing it down, some of the species, like we had, very few data points. They just died at extremely low concentrations. So blue grama was the most tolerant. So that, I guess that would be the native species I would recommend, but I think it would depend on also the concentrations of the sterilants in the soil, if it would be able to survive or not.
Right. Is there, this isn't my area, but is there a way to test the concentration of the sterilants and what kind there are in the soil?
Yeah, so it's done by a lab. You'd have to send the samples to an analytical lab. Yeah.
Okay.
It is pretty expensive
to get
analysis.
it tested.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question is from Fionn. How did you choose the species to test, and why did you use a different subset of species for the 2 herbicides?
Yeah, so we chose those species. There's kind of 2 sources we used. So I did reference on my final slide, Chris Powder, he's from Alberta. He developed a list of the reclamation mixes that are used in the province and which species are included in those. And so we based our selection on which species were most commonly used in those mixes. And then also we did speak to some experts who have dealt with sterilant-impacted sites throughout their work career and which species they thought would be important to include. So those were our 2 sources. And we used a different subset because there was, for one of the sterilants, there was already a bit more species information on it. It had more species tested historically. And so we just put fewer species into the one, basically.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is from Rennie. Do you know what the impacts of soil sterilants may have on soil microbiology?
Yeah, so, well, I'm not exactly sure. So soil microbes are actually more my background than soil sterilants. So I think that is a really interesting topic. But I don't know what the impact is. I imagine, yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I know the sterilants are herbicides. They're meant to target the plants, but I can only imagine that would have some effect on the microbes. Um, yeah, I know, like, over time, I believe microbes will slowly degrade sterilants, but I think with sterilants, that's a really, really slow process.
Okay, thank you. This question is from Clinton. What about selective herbicides like Tordon? Are they a long-term issue to review? Do you have any
I'm
comments?
not sure. Yeah, I know the program that I'm working within is focused on sterilants and just really those two. But there was a review done at the beginning, and I'm not sure if they did touch on Tordon or other herbicides like that. But I'm sure any herbicide that's had long-term applications and is persistent would probably be an issue as well.
Okay, thank you. And this question is from Elaine. Has there been any studies regarding longer-term condition of plantings after seedling stage?
I'm not sure. Yeah, that is one thing I think about with the protocol we used. It is such a small. The plants are really tiny still when at the end of that experiment, and so I do wonder what would happen if you grew them longer. I was told previously that like the longer you run these experiments, you expect toxicity to increase over time as the plants have more time, I guess, to be impacted by it. So maybe that's partly why these experiments are short, but I agree. I think it would be interesting to do a long-term one, but I'm not sure if that has been done.
Okay, thank you. Here's a bit of a longer one from Shirley. What steps towards soil restoration would you expect to be necessary following exposure to soil sterilants? Is it just a question of waiting for the sterilants to degrade, and how long would that take? Or do you think we would need to remove that soil as seen as a practice in Jonas's talk yesterday?
Right. So I don't think with sterilants you can really. I think it's harder to wait for them to degrade just because they are so persistent, and some of them are also quite mobile, and so you have the potential for leaching to groundwater and causing other issues. So soil removal would be an option. There are remediation. There's another project within this program that I'm working on, looking at the historical use of activated charcoal, which was used as a technique in the past. It basically sorbs the sterilants to the charcoal, and so it's still there, but it's not available to plants.
Okay.
And so I think I believe that there's still work looking at using charcoal or other sorbents in other ways as a way to just make it less available to plants without having to remove everything.
Right. Okay. And Stephen has a follow-up question. Are you aware of any remediation methods that involve sterilant breakdown in the soil?
So the methods that I'm more familiar with are those sorbing technologies. So charcoal. I think there is something else. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the breakdown, a remediation technology to break down the sterilant.
Okay.
If you are interested, I can always. Someone at InnoTech is the head of that program, and she could always maybe provide more information. So I can provide her email if people are interested as well.
Yeah, that would be great. We can, like, I don't know if it would be her contact information or like a document, but if there's a link, we can share it on the session page.
Okay.
People can access it when they go see the recording of today's session.
Okay, yeah, I can.
Like that, we can figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Rennie Grills, who is a resource management officer with Meewasin Valley Authority. And he's also on the Native Prairie Restoration Reclamation Workshop Planning Committee. So this morning, Rennie will be discussing ways to engage the public to design and install the best restoration project possible. So Rennie, if you want to turn on your microphone and your webcam. In the AV pod under my face, there's the little webcam camera and the microphone icons. There we go.
Thanks, Carolyn. I've talked to this a couple of times and I still couldn't do it right.
It's a little bit tricky, so we understand.
If anyone knows me, I carry a BlackBerry, so technology is sometimes not the easiest for me. So,
okay, I'll let you take over.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. And yeah, thank you to Carolyn and Caitlin for organizing this conference. It was my honor to be on the planning committee. And when we started our discussions right after COVID hit, we weren't sure how we could do this. So it seems to be working quite well. I miss seeing everyone in person, but hopefully everyone's enjoying this conference. So I was asked to talk about public engagement in terms of getting people engaged and supporting restoration projects. So I work for Meewasin Valley Authority in Saskatoon, and we have a broad mandate. And our mandate, we're sort of a regional conservation authority, but we're also responsible for education programs in the South Saskatchewan River Valley, and also we provide access to the river valley, but also we have a regulatory function as well in terms of development. So we have a really broad mandate, which sometimes we have conflict within our programs as well, because we do develop the trail along the river valley, but then also we have to restore and conserve those sites as well. So I have quite a few staff here from Meewasin joining me on this conference, and from different departments, and we're always trying to balance that development and conservation, that education aspect. But it does result in some really interesting projects that we get to work on in the Saskatoon region. Just a little bit about us. We were formed in 1979. Our mandate is the conservation of the South Saskatchewan River throughout the city of Saskatoon and throughout our McCormick Park. We're responsible for about 6,700 hectares of land, and we have everything from downtown Saskatoon, River Valley, to natural areas within the city of Saskatoon, and then also natural areas outside of the city as well, and islands in the river. So it gives us a really diverse landscape to work in, diverse communities of to work with people as well to engage, and from rural landowners to downtown urbanites to some impoverished communities as well. And so that really provides an opportunity to really engage people in different aspects of conservation and restoration, and also providing access to the South Saskatchewan River. So the Society for Ecological Restoration developed principles and standards for the practice of ecological restoration in 2019. And these main 8 principles sort of guide how organizations should follow or develop restoration programs within their area. And so going through that list, you have engaging stakeholders, you use many knowledge types, you use your program is informed by reference communities. You look at recovery of ecosystems. You have to set clear objectives and goals. Also, you try and seek that highest level of recovery. You want to gain cumulative value in your projects. So when you're looking at small scale, but you apply that across the larger landscape. And then you want to continue those restoration activities. So in the talk I'm giving today is really looking at engaging stakeholders. And then I'm doing a talk this afternoon on access to knowledge and other sources of knowledge. And so a lot of the presenters, even this morning and this afternoon, will talk about some of those different knowledge types as well. So within that framework from Society for Ecological Restoration, the stakeholder engagement looks at sort of 3 main components. They look at the type of involvement that's attracted within You're looking for that support that's maintained over time for restoration. And then also, has your capacity been increased with restoration over time? And, the engagement of stakeholders, really helps build your program and continues that long-term support. Um, One of the things that Society for Ecological Restoration has developed is sort of a 5-star program for these different attributes, these 8 different attributes. And for the stakeholder engagement, the more engagement that you have, and the more long-term support you have, and how you engage those stakeholders, really gives your program a stronger, I guess, a stronger star. Sort of like when you think of 5-star hotels versus a 1-star Roach Motel kind of thing. The more engagement you have, the stronger your project will become, and the more support you'll have also with the general public. So building the public trust is really important in your restoration projects, and it doesn't matter where you're working. You could be restoring a quarter section of native prairie, of cropland to native prairie in the middle of southern Saskatchewan. You still have stakeholders. It could be the different conservation communities. It could be the neighboring landowners. It could be the partner, the producer that you're working with, or the nearby rancher who might eventually be grazing that land. And so engaging those stakeholders and developing that trust will really have an influence on your process and the outcomes of the restoration. And the more trust and support that you develop, the greater success of your project. This picture here is actually of a site. We were doing a weed tour about 5 years ago on a site that we've started. It's sort of an abandoned field within the city of Saskatoon. It was created for a storm pond, and it's been abandoned. We were sort of our go-to weed tour spot, and Mewasson's engaged with the city of Saskatoon to restore this site. And so this was actually part of a weed tour with weed inspectors of the Saskatoon area, and discussing how to control the weeds, and then get to a stage for restoration. Then also continuing that building that's public support. And when members of the public are involved, they can provide that sustained support, and the community will help with creating that lasting ecological stakeholder and learning successes. And the more people that are engaged, the more people that are in support, the more people will respond as well in the general public. This picture here is of a tour we had with some elders on a project we're working with at the Northeast Swale. And we talked about different aspects of the resource management work we're doing at the Swale, restoring natural processes, and then also doing ecological restoration. And so engaging those elders really brought some wonderful insight to myself on how we can develop these restoration programs to incorporate other worldviews into these projects. Also, when you're building that public support, you can understand some of the social economic drivers and the impacts those have on those restoration projects. So if you're working on a pipeline restoration project, discussing with those nearby stakeholders on how the success would look, on how to maybe deal with that restoration. So if you're working with a producer that has a really intact, beautiful native prairie, and the stakeholders concerned about invasive grass invasion, like say crested wheatgrass to the middle of his pasture because of that pipeline restoration, that is an economic driver. That producer knows that having those invasive grasses or an unsuccessful restoration project will have some economic loss to him or her. So taking that consideration into your designs is very important. Incorporating that inclusivity and those different worldviews. And I've been working in the restoration field for almost 30 years now, and this is a really exciting part of restoration that I wish we would have had 30 years ago when we started doing restoration. We really focused on the agronomics aspects back in the early days, but bringing in these different worldviews, I think, is really going to make these projects even more successful. And then garnering that public support. So if people understand what you're doing in terms of restoration, what restoration is, what you can do with restoration, and then also giving them access to those sites afterwards, will create sort of that public support, which also creates funding opportunities as well. The more people that talk about restoration and the need for it, the more money there is as well available. If you look at the recent announcement by the federal government of the 2 billion trees planted in Canada over the next 10 years, that is a form of ecological restoration. And there is a public support for that. And hopefully over time, we can maybe work with our federal government and our provincial governments to develop additional programs to create that support for prairie restoration. There is some money, project funding there, but maybe we can get some large scale projects as well to tie in with that. And that public support is tied to other objectives as well. However, public engagement always has its challenges. If anyone's ever watched the TV show Parks and Recreation and seeing the challenges that people have with engaging the public, you always get 90% of those questions from the public are just filler, but sometimes you get those really good gems of questions and concerns and comments that can really help you build your programs and bring in some new ideas and perspectives. I have sort of a group of people that I always ask questions to that are usually my biggest challengers and within the public. And but with those challenges that they throw at you, you can actually develop some new innovative ideas. And so, a lot of people are scared to do that in public engagement because they know they're going to get the tough questions. But I think if you embrace that and look at those opportunities and those gems within those questions, you can really take that and develop a good project. So this paper from Metcalf et al. Recommended 5 ways to effectively engage the public on restoration projects. And the first one they recommended was utilize multiple forums. So typically if you ever work with any urban planners or those planning type people, they really like things like open houses, that kind of planning forum. But there's other ways as well. Could be as simple as you're out on your site doing restoration projects, and if someone comes by and you talk to them, that is a form of engagement. Social media, especially during this COVID area, we're really seeing lots of opportunities to engage people that would normally not participate, whether it's through Zoom meetings or even just feedback through social media. When you're working on engagement or working on a project, the key is to engage at the earliest stages possible with the public or with your stakeholders, and then also bring them in at various decision points. I've worked on several projects here at Meewasin in terms of conservation planning and developing a monitoring framework, and we bring in a group of technical advisors and stakeholders, and the key is to bring them in as soon as you can so they know what you're working on, but then also seek advice from them at sort of key points when you're working on those projects. Also, you want to provide opportunities for them to have dialogue with you, and and to provide feedback, whether it's one-on-one discussions or reviewing documents, or just even being on a site tour and having sort of kicking that dirt and looking at that project. Also, look at ways to sustain that engagement over long term. The more you can continue engaging the people on your project, the greater support you're going to have and the greater buy-in you're going to have as well with the community. Also, demonstrations are a great way to engage people, and having people know what you're talking about and what you're doing. And whether it's, you're seeding a quarter section down to native prairie and you install a sign, or you work with the local watershed group to deliver a tour with local producers, it's important to have these abilities to show these small scale projects to people to get that buy-in and support. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some examples of some of the different projects that I've been involved with here around Saskatoon, and sort of some of these ways to engage the public. So this project here was led by a group of university students taking a 400 level environmental studies class, and they approached me, Wasson, and also the City of Saskatoon Naturalized Parks Program, Moira Moser, and they were looking at an opportunity to do part of the class is to develop a project that betters the environment in and around the University of Saskatoon or Saskatchewan, and engaging and delivering of that project. And so these students were looking at ways to enhance pollinator habitat within the river valley, and they were looking for an opportunity. So this is the old Mendel Art Gallery. It's on the east side of the building facing the South Saskatchewan River and the Meewasin Trail. And there was an opportunity to do a demonstration garden of different wildflowers. And so Moira was leading this project and worked with these students. They sourced local wildflowers from a local company, and the students helped plant these wildflowers with Moira and her team. I think the long-term intention is to put other things in there like bat boxes, bee hotels, and other infrastructure to sort of engage to provide those pollinator services, but also provide an opportunity for the public to see this as well. This is actually one of the busiest stretches of the Meewasin Valley Trails in Saskatoon, with upwards of 500,000 people walk by this every year. And so it's a really busy portion of the river valley, and it's a great way to engage the public. And I think Moira's looking at planning some signage as well to engage the public with this. Also, there's the opportunity to engage artists. This is a project led by a spoken word artist, an Indigenous artist. His name is Kevin Wasakati. I butchered his name. Sorry, Kevin. And he started this project called the Misaskotomina project, which is Saskatoon Berry Project. And so his project was to do an art installation in Victoria Park. He did an installation in 2018, and he did another one in 2020. And it was part of his the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation, providing food security and bringing people back to the land. And so in this picture here, this was back in June, late June of this year, he organized volunteers to plant 450 Saskatoon berry bushes. And there's actually quite a few people in the conference here today that were part of that volunteer group. And it's to provide access to the inner city people back to the land, provide that food security, but also from a restoration perspective. This is a former industrial site in the city of Saskatoon, and it was turned into a green space with Kentucky bluegrass and creeping red fescue grass. But we're restoring these wonderful Saskatoon berry bushes back to its natural habitat. But also, it's engaging people with this. And so I think Kevin has plans to do this all over the city over the years. And, there was a lot of partners on this project. And it was something that, it was great that Meewasin could partner with all the other people on this project. Also, naturalization projects. So Moira, I'm going to give Moira another plug. She's been working on, she runs the Naturalized Parks program in Saskatoon. So usually what happens is Meewasin takes over habitats that have native prairie on it, or more natural habitats. And then Moira's program takes parks that have sort of that combination of natural elements like aspen stands, but then also grass, tame grass stands that she's trying to naturalize back to sort of some ecological function. And so over the years, her and her team have been working on projects where they're trying to reintroduce native grasses and native wildflowers into their parks. And just to increase the diversity, increase those pollinator services, but also just to engage the public on the value of these native plants. And it's interesting watching the evolution of these sites over time, and how people become attached to seeing these wildflowers in their backyard parks. And it's quite an exciting project. And I have to give her a lot of kudos for leading a project like this. Also, interpretation signs. So this is, Meewasin is part of our education mandate. We do provide a lot of signage within the River Valley. Quite often the signage is a combination of cultural history, of Saskatoon and the River Valley. We're working on some projects on some Indigenous knowledge as well. But also we are working on some signage to talk about some of our ecological. The one with the snow-covered picture is one from our Chief Whitecap Park site south of the city. We restored back in 2015. We just put native prairie, or sorry, we just added a Meewasin Trail and some interpretive signage to improve, to let people know about native prairie and the value of restoration. We've also started doing some of these pop-up signs as well on different resource management activities like our prescribed burning program and our targeted grazing program. Projects or burning projects, we can leave these signs up and people can see them over time. And we're developing some new ones this year as well for grazing, or sorry, for restoration, and then also for ecological monitoring, hopefully, and then also for invasive species management. And so it's another way of engaging the people. I find that if we have the signage and we're out doing field work and we see people looking at these signs, if we go up and talk to them, it's a great way to engage them. And then volunteer events. People seem to really love to get out and plant wildflowers and grasses in disturbed sites. And we've delivered a few volunteer events over the years, and we're looking at developing more volunteer events over time. I know Nature Conservancy here in Saskatchewan has done quite a few events over the years as well. And Morgan and Mike talked about some of the work that they were doing in some of their projects to engage volunteers in restoration. And we work with everything from school groups, or people including school groups, different interest groups, and even we've done some plantings with tours of from different conferences and bringing people in from different parts of North America. We did one a couple years ago, having people plant Saskatoonberry bushes at the Northeast Swale, and it was just a way to engage people with the land and at least start that discussion on restoration. In demonstration projects, so doing some new technique and showcasing some of these Saskatoon in your community and letting people know about this. So this is a project that we worked with the South Saskatchewan River Watershed Stewards, where we were actually adding aquatic plants into a structure in a storm pond, nutrients and heavy metals out of the storm water before it goes into the river system. And it's we engaged volunteers the first year in 2019, 2020 we couldn't because of COVID, but we have an interpretive sign and we get a lot of questions about the project. And we worked with Steve Tanis out of Alberta. He provided the structures, and it looks like a very successful project to engage people on the value of restoration of wetlands from an aquatic perspective. And so take-home messages. So your public engagement can take many forms. Don't be scared to engage the public, and determine what fits best with your program. But that engagement can build you a better program. Also, it builds you that longer public support and understanding of what you're doing, and will hopefully lead to new funding sources. And also, don't be scared to take those negative comments or that negative feedback from people and view them as an opportunity to make your project even stronger. And it's a great way to learn new innovative techniques as well. So with that, thank you very much, and looking forward to any questions.
Rennie, thank you for all the tips.
Oh, there's Carolyn.
Hi.
There you are.
Those were great tips for engaging the public. We do have some time for questions. There are quite a few. We'll start at the beginning. Here we go. Here's one from Marshall. It says, excellent for tame green spaces. Are the forbs seeded or plug planted?
Yeah, so Moira's done a combination of both. She's done a lot of forb plugs planting, and then also has done some seed spreading. And she's tried different techniques. She's done things like planting beds to removing like 1 square foot of sod and then planting into those sod. We've done some work as well where we've gone in and just used a auger, just a little drill auger, and then put those plugs directly in. I've also done projects where I've spread grass seed, native grass seed and wildflowers into sort of that thatch layer. Challenges, you don't get that great of a successful establishment, so you have to do some sort of technique to get that good seed to soil contact. So whether applying it, run your sheep through and when you're grazing, or some other techniques. But yeah, it can be done.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Tracy. How has prescribed burning been received by citizens?
Yeah, and that's always a really tough one, and it depends where you are in Western Canada. Definitely in the Manitoba portions, in the Winnipeg area, prescribed fire is a fairly common tool. Here in Saskatoon, we've been using prescribed fire since the mid-1980s ourselves, and the University of Saskatchewan and the City of Saskatoon. So it's actually fairly well received. When we do prescribed burns here in Saskatoon, we get a lot of the public coming out to watch, and then are interested in what we're doing. It was funny, I did a burn a few years ago at Cranberry Flats Conservation Area, and I was just out doing some field work, and people didn't know I was there, and they saw post-fire. And one of the things I heard them talking, and they said, "Oh, I can't wait till next year. We're going to see more crocuses in this spot." So, people are becoming more engaged. We have to do more work to help them understand. And we're leading an initiative with many partners to develop a prescribed fire exchange for the Canadian prairies. And so we're hoping to announce this in the next couple of months. But it's a way for all the agencies that are doing fire on the landscape to work together and then share resources and to help engage the public more meaningful way.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is from Madison. From your experience, what methods or techniques have worked well with the rural community?
What I've worked with a lot of rural communities and producer groups over the years, and talking one-on-one is the best. Meeting with someone out on the land, looking at their operation, and developing that relationship and that friendship. Kicking the dirt, kicking around cow pies. I find that's probably definitely the most effective. Town hall meetings, you get people there, but and one of the things that Lauren Fitch with the Cows and Fish program in Alberta, when I worked with him on some programs out there when I worked in Alberta with Nature Conservancy, he always said, share food. Share drink, whether it's coffee or even a beer, and to develop that relationship. And he sort of related it to sort of the religious aspect, sharing, breaking bread with people. And that's one of the things I've really found is being able to do that is, having those relationships. And I know in a lot of Indigenous communities as well, that's a really important factor as well, is taking the time to share. COVID makes it a little bit more difficult, but definitely, just that one-on-one relationship is probably the most effective.
Great, we have time for a few more. There's a question about the demonstration projects and aquatic native plants. Do you know if you had any birds like grebes and terns nest on the islands?
Yeah, the first year in 2019, we only had 2 islands. This year we've added another 11. We did that in the fall. Major issue with geese utilizing those islands, and so we're trying to figure out some different techniques to try and they didn't, but they're using them as loafing islands. So we had a fairly decent of the plants, about 50% with the geese, but the public really need them as well. So you have to balance that aspect. But Tanis with those island structures, he has some recommendations, and he's trying different ways as well to reduce that nesting ability of bird species.
Okay. The next is from Mandy. What methods have you found to be successful in getting City Council approval on restoration projects?
Yeah. Well, I think, we're fortunate here in Saskatoon. So the Mewasin's mandate includes, our board of directors is made up of City of Saskatoon, University of Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan. And we have 4 representatives from the city council. And so we ought to, we get that buy-in from the political side because of our mandate. But working with developing relationships with different organizations within the city, different departments. Here in Saskatoon, we have a naturalized parks program. Also, there's a sustainability division as well. And so developing those relationships with those different agencies and departments within within the city really help make it a lot stronger. Also, there are advocacy groups as well that can sort of do some of that hard work for you behind the scenes. You work behind the scenes and they're more out in the front, and sometimes they can move things through a little bit easier than you can working with the government.
Great, thanks, Rennie. That's all the time we have for questions this morning. There are a few still in the chat pod if you wanted to stick around and answer them. And if any of our attendees wants to learn more about what Mewasin is up to, a few posters in the poster session that you can go over to. The final presentation this will be co-presented by Nathan Cardinal, who is a senior advisor of Indigenous Relations, and Martin, who is a conservation science coordinator from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And they will be talking about improving conservation through building and maintaining relationships with Indigenous communities. Thanks for being here, Nathan and Kristen. And the screen is yours.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks to the other presenters and the organizers of the conference. It's just wonderful to be part of the session today around planning, and to hear Rennie talk as well. I kind of just say my presentation could essentially just be ditto to what he's talked about as well too. So it's great to see all the knowledge that people have been sharing, and I think kind of reflect a bit of a common theme around thinking about the more complex restoration gets, the more we need to engage with neighbors and other knowledge holders, and kind of really be intentional in our planning to achieve those durable conservation outcomes. So today, Kristen and I will talk about something that many of people are doing or thinking of doing about when it comes to their conservation and restoration planning, and that's engagement with Indigenous peoples. And I'll talk a bit about a sort of a broad overview, and then Kristen will probably give a much more interesting presentation on a specific example in Saskatchewan that they've been working on as well too. So, and I look forward to any sort of dialogue or questions that kind of come up as well. So I'm just going to try to move my slide. So just to kind of really back up for a moment, today's contemporary conservation movement has really done quite a number of amazing things. Globally, it's created over 250 protected areas across more than 250 countries. It's protected about 10% of the global landmass, which is quite something. And in Canada, it's no small slouch either. Over the last 150 years or so, about 1 million square kilometers of land has been protected. It's about 11% and change of the terrestrial landscape in Canada. So quite impressive. But a lot of that, sometimes has come at a cost, especially to those most vulnerable and those living closest to the land. And in Canada and many places around the world, that's been for Indigenous people. And they've been heavily impacted. Lands have been expropriated to create new protected areas over the years. Rights and ability to access traditional lands, access traditional foods, and kind of engage in those cultural economies have really been downplayed or degraded or stopped altogether. And conservation in Canada is no exception as well. You've seen a lot of forced expropriation and loss of homes as a result of new protected areas. And we've seen and heard of places in Canada as well, and a lot of national parks establishment where this has happened as well. And so, in many places as well, and Indigenous people really only considered when it was profitable to do so. But luckily today, we don't see a lot of that overt type of action anymore, but those legacies still really have resonance as well, and oftentimes is still within the living memory of many Indigenous people in Canada. And so those challenges still exist, and those things we need to kind of overcome, and things a lot of people are working towards. But even thinking about how we approach conservation today, it's still not necessarily in alignment or meet with sort of how Indigenous people interpret conservation, or what that may mean, or what sort of their stewardship and rights and responsibilities to the land are. And that, is even, in thinking about how Indigenous efforts have relatively proven fairly reliable in sort of managing and steward the land over millennia. And so, it'd be great to have an Indigenous knowledge holder speak and share their understandings opposed to myself, but I'll just, with that in mind, I'll just provide a few relatively interesting, hopefully interesting stats here as well for folks. So while Indigenous people themselves really they represent about 5% of the global population, Indigenous peoples managed land covers about a quarter of the Earth's globe, and overlaps with about a third of all terrestrial protected areas in the world. And about, I think, 40% of sort of undeveloped areas globally overlap with Indigenous peoples' land as well. And interestingly enough, about 8% of the world's biodiversity occurs on Indigenous managed lands. And when we think about Indigenous lands in Canada, this map here is from a website called nativelands.ca, which shows the different Indigenous territories at a fairly national scale all across Canada. And what you can see is that essentially Indigenous territories cover every corner, coast, and crag of the country. And so while we may not necessarily see eye to eye on things, even the very nature of wanting to be good stewards and neighbors kind of impels us to engage with local communities, local Indigenous nations, and doubly so if actually by doing so we can collectively improve what's happening on the ground and improve our abilities to kind of conserve and restore land. And that also allows us to accomplish some really other interesting things as well. And today, I'd say we stand kind of on a cusp of renewed efforts towards conservation. And whether that's thinking about international conservation commitments, increased federal and provincial government support, and growing conservation challenges really have only increased the need for more conservation and restoration efforts, not less. But we want to make sure that what we do and those renewed efforts don't result in the same challenges that we've faced in the past and the problems that have created. And so we have an opportunity really to kind of reimagine conservation, I'd say, and undertake it in a way that supports the growing recognition of Indigenous rights in Canada, and supports the continuation of Indigenous leadership in conservation, and it really helps to renew those connections to the land. And we have an opportunity to build collaborative partnerships and move forward in a way that's really respectful across shared landscapes. And so we can reimagine conservation future and what that means, and ensuring ways that support conservation and reconciliation rather than conservation at the expense of reconciliation. But saying that and doing that are two different things, and I realize it's not necessarily easy. So kind of how do we do that, and where does that leave NCC? So the Nature Conservancy of Canada is a place-based non-governmental organization, and it's been working since 1962 with a variety of individuals, organizations, governments to help acquire and manage more than 14. And so over the years, like many of you on the workshop today, have worked diligently to restore and maintain the ecological integrity of those places, and building knowledge and experience in conservation all the while. And those are definitely things we can really be proud of. And by the very nature of this work, it's been great, provided a lot of opportunity to partner and collaborate with different First Nations and Métis communities and support Indigenous conservation efforts to conserve and steward traditional territories. But we also realize that those contemporary approaches to conservation need to be renewed and evolved and adapted, and think about how we can engage with Indigenous nations to support Indigenous-led conservation. And so as an organization, we kind of stand on the cusp of renewing approaches as well, and needing to think better about how we engage with communities and Indigenous people, and realize we need to think about how we go about supporting Indigenous conservation and doing the business of conservation a little bit differently. And so how do we catalyze the work that we've done already and think more strategically and kind of learn from others going along the way. And so these questions aren't restricted to NCC by any means, and many individuals and organizations that have been presenting already, and many of you, I was going to say here in the room, but virtually as well, are also asking themselves the same thing. And so one of those opportunities is to be able to learn from each other and share both kind of the good and the bad, and look for those lessons learned or patterns that really kind of articulate a path forward. Please help us figure out what questions we should be asking and figure out what that initial step to take is. And just to fully acknowledge that learning from examples, I think, is really important and informative. But just to remember that it doesn't necessarily work all the time. It doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and it differs from community to community. And really the most respectful way to proceed is to just go out and engage with those First Nations or Métis or other people that you want to engage with. Be ready for, as Rennie was saying, be ready for those criticisms and challenges. But they're going to be the experts at defining what a positive relations looks like and how they want it to be engaged. But with that, I'll share a few examples of some different projects that I and colleagues at NCC have been working on over the years, and talk about just some lessons learned as well too. So I am currently on assignment actually with NCC over the next couple of years, and I've worked for Parks Canada for about the last 15 years or so as well in resource conservation. And in 2014, we began a 5-year restoration project to experimentally restore what are called clam gardens and kind of document how Coast Salish Indigenous stewardship practices alongside scientific knowledge could be used to improve the health of intertidal areas and really help to identify new approaches to restoration and what we were calling kind of ecocultural landscapes in ways that also supported positive conservation outcomes as well as Indigenous leadership. So clam gardens themselves are actually kind of these really cool intertidal features that were constructed and stewarded by Indigenous people over millennia up and down much of the Pacific coast. And so they're kind of characterized by these boulder walls at the low tide line with this sand clam flat behind them. And they're built in such a way and in such locations to actually change slopes of beach and enhance shellfish production there. And kind of really ingenious constructions and reflect kind of a bit of the high level of knowledge that were held by Indigenous people to actively enhance and sustain these full intertidal ecosystems in one particular spot over generations. And while we colloquially refer to them as clam gardens, they actually did a lot more than just benefit clams, and were there for a variety of other purposes. The photo behind, which didn't show up as well, unfortunately, was one site that we worked on of a clam garden. Is over. These places can range in size anywhere from a few meters across to over 1 kilometer long. And one of the ones we were working on was quite substantial, about 1 kilometer long, anywhere from 5 meters to 10 meters wide. And just at the bottom of the slide there, you can see some of the rocks that form part of the wall, and each one of those rocks was moved by hand. So you can imagine something that big and the amount of effort and intention that would go into kind of creating them. So the project we were involved in was the first restoration of a clam garden in contemporary times, and was built up through kind of a shared concern between Parks Canada and the local nations about the health of these beaches. And so based on kind of that common objective, we really worked as a group to co-develop and co-lead the project and place Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous management techniques, and knowledge holders themselves really at the forefront of that project, and had science play a sort of a supportive and collaborative role to help monitor and assess the results using a bit of a two-eyed seeing approach. And so over time, we had many people there, many sort of ecological successes, a lot of social successes, a lot of breakthroughs in building relationships with communities. And that really, a lot of that can be attributed to the Hul'qumi'num and Wasanich people that we worked with, who really guided the process. We were able to form 2 Indigenous knowledge working groups that were determined by the nations, and they determined how we would restore the areas. And we undertook those methods hand in hand on the beaches under the watchful guidance of those committees for over 5 years. And really by creating space for Indigenous leadership and building that trust has really allowed us to build strong relationships that last to this day. And we were able to partner with over 10 different nations, numerous post-secondary institutions, and hundreds of volunteers to do this project and build capacity amongst nations and Parks Canada, and really follow protocol and ceremony and Indigenous restoration and management techniques to kind of do this project. And while I said it started in 2014, it actually began about 6 years before that in a stuffy boardroom somewhere. We were meeting with elders and other community members. We were talking about the importance of shellfish, and that they really wanted to be able to be back on the beaches where they grew up and have their their youth back there as well too. And so we collectively just worked on small projects and had small conversations here or there, which really led to a larger and larger things, and that snowballed into building this larger collaborative restoration project. And it's really helped how we approach conservation and restoration and really changed that, and has acted really as a template for how we do other projects to achieve outcomes that are really more than just about ecological restoration goals. Another project that NCC has been involved in for quite a number of years is looking at, in Southern Ontario, is working with others on as part of the Rice Lake Plains Partnership to protect and prairie ecosystems, only 2% of which remain in Ontario, and what's left is really badly fragmented and inundated with invasive species. And, you know, as Rennie was mentioning as well, we're working there to put fire back on the landscape as well, which has kind of been one of those long critical ecosystem processes that have been removed from the region for many years. And in fact, the region is actually known as, I'm also not going to pronounce this that well, but Pemba Dakota, or Lake of Burning Plains by the Anishinaabe people. And so aside from managing the land for many generations, the Alderville First Nation there has been working since the 90s to actively restore the black oak savanna that's found on their reserve lands in the region, which are kind of a culturally and ecologically important area for the nations. And after Alderville became part of the Rice Lake Plains Partnership in 2008, NCC was able to build relationships with the nation about, again, a kind of a common space and thinking about common objectives. And through that engagement, NCC and Alderville were able to sign a collaborative agreement in about 2012 on kind of working together on restoration, on management, as well as interpretation of the Rice Lake Plains. And this opportunity to build that relationship on a sort of a common place, on a common set of goals and principles, has helped to build understanding, capacity and efficiency for both Alderville and NCC. And creating that space to build relationships from the ground up, being able to support capacity through funding, you know, committing to work together, have all really been kind of key factors in the success of that ongoing restoration work, and has helped it to move beyond a purely sort of transactional relationship about a particular restoration area to one of a really stewardship partnership in a shared space with intertwined intentions and a collaborative vision for restoration for the future. Flipping back to Parks Canada for a moment, as many of you know, restoration can be a bit of a many-headed beast, and oftentimes challenging situations where we're trying to work across landscapes to achieve common conservation objectives, but where folks may not necessarily see eye to eye. And so in the Southern Gulf Islands, Parks Canada has been working on restoration of at-risk coastal Douglas fir ecosystems on a small island called Sydney Island in the Southern Gulf Islands. And about in the early 20th century, a population of deer called fallow deer were introduced to the island. And, you know, not having a lot of predators, they really quickly adapted to the island. They quite loved the habitat, and the population densities there exploded to be amongst the highest of anywhere found in the world. And as deer do when they grow and they populate, they love to eat, and over time have since denuded much of the forest understory over the years. The photo on the top right there is one of a deer exclosure that's been there for about 20 years or so, so you can kind of see the mowed landscape that the deer have kind of created and what would potentially be there if the deer populations were either non-existent or much reduced. And so, you know, dealing with introduced and hyperabundant deer and those resultant impacts is challenging enough. But on Sydney Island, it's kind of further complicated by the layered jurisdictions and relationships on the island. So the northern third of the island in blue there on the map is national park land. And the southern 2/3 are privately owned, about amongst a strata of about 80 owners. A regional conservancy manages some of the smaller yellow portions there. The province manages the wildlife across the southern 2/3 of the island. And of course, layered over all of this are the rights, responsibilities, and connections of about 6 First Nations to that landscape as well. And so everyone kind of agreed that the island wasn't really doing well, but no one really agreed on what needed to happen. And there's kind of been little trust and little engagement or relationship building amongst the various involved parties. So building that cohesion and that trust has been an ongoing effort. But specifically speaking about working with the Indigenous communities there, for a variety of reasons, it was key to have them be part of the decision-making process and be able to recognize their rights and responsibilities to the land. So we formed a steering committee to guide the project, where all parties came to the table as equals. We worked towards consensus and focused on a common goal. And while working towards that goal, it really allowed the opportunity to build relationships, not just between the nations and Parks Canada, but amongst all parties. And really by co-developing the project and co-identifying what the goals and the objectives were going to be, and thinking about the decision-making in a shared way has really been critical to ensuring for the nations that their rights and responsibilities are represented. And a key thing that we've also done beyond just thinking about decision-making and that strategic standpoint is at sort of an operational and community level was facilitating connections back to the land. And so we were able to facilitate a number of elders and youth hunting camps to kind of start restoration efforts on the island, while also being able to connect youth to the landscape, provide opportunities to kind of learn skills from elders and be able to engage in traditional practices and be able to think about food security and some of those other things that were important to the nations as well. And supporting those types of objectives has been, crucial in building trust amongst leaders and elders in the community, and has really been important that they feel comfortable and they have a say at the table. And by thinking about youth and these opportunities and growing this capacity has really helped us also to build future leaders and restoration workers for tomorrow. And so while the conversation about the restoration efforts continue, we've got a commitment from all parties actually through a number of formal and informal agreements to kind of continue on that path of restoration. We all kind of continue to want to work together. So the last example I'll quickly mention as well has been, one closer to home in terms of prairie restoration. And that's been about a learning the land project, whereby through supporting hands-on learning, we've had the opportunity to build future stewards of tomorrow again. And in efforts to help conserve those highly at-risk native prairies in Saskatchewan, as well as support revitalization of Indigenous languages, NCC has been able to partner with the Treaty 4 Education Alliance on what's called Learning the Land Education Initiative, which focuses really around building awareness and understanding of species at risk and conservation of native prairie amongst the students of Treaty Education Alliance affiliated schools. And so through the Learning the Land program, the students have been able to gain valuable land-based teachings through a combination of Western science and Indigenous knowledge, and build understanding and awareness of Indigenous connections to the land. And that partnership has been wonderful, and it kind of continues to evolve. But regardless of its state, a key success has really been reflecting and respecting both Western and Indigenous knowledge and perspectives of the land, and kind of sharing learnings about native prairies. And key to the success, again, has been that connection with elders and Indigenous knowledge holders. And the opportunity for youth to learn from experts in their own community has been invaluable to all aspects of the project. And that regular and ongoing engagement between NCC and the Education Alliance at all phases of the project really has helped to contribute to its ongoing evolution and its ability to respond to kind of community needs and interests as that kind of grew and changed over the years. So based on those successful projects, and some not so successful as well, it's kind of a general pattern that's emerged over the years, which we've applied a lot to different projects over time. And key, as first is just taking the time to educate myself and spending time to identify and learn about the nations within the areas we work. Treaties are an interesting thing where oftentimes it's an agreement that's signed between parties. So in one way, we're actually, many of us are all treaty people, and learning about those treaties, those rights, those histories and cultures really help us to better understand and better think about where we're coming from and how we can kind of contribute to reconciliation going forward. And as well as, once we think about that, we also need to think about what's the best ways to engage? How do we kind of think about a little bit deliberately around kind of how we plan that engagement? And especially today, in kind of light of COVID-19, being able to think about how, what situations people find themselves in, how busy they may be or not be, and what are some of the effective ways to engage or to hold off. And so these are all things, those type of steps are all things we can do on our own, but kind of the key to this work, and something that you can't do on your own, is building and maintaining those relationships. And recognize that this takes time and effort, but what really results is sort of a truly transformative conservation projects over the long term. So, and just thinking about some of those things and what were some of the key successes that we had over the years, or that were really important to achieving those positive outcomes, was you know, I was thinking about being aware that it's not necessarily easy, and that in some ways we need to think about those hard questions, or thinking that we realize that we may not succeed all the time, and we may not necessarily be patted on the back when we try to engage or try to build some of those relationships, but realize that it's important, and that being able to kind of commit to that relationship and move forward in that space is really, really important. I'd say the worst thing we can do is actually not reaching out and not working to build that relationship. It's important to be able to kind of consider your resources and realize that these things take time, both on our part as well on the part of the nations themselves. And how do we be able to support that? How do we make sure that we're building capacity amongst staff to be able to engage appropriately and respectfully? And so in doing that, you know, and in doing that engagement and committing to that, we need to ensure and recognize that things will change over time, and that being flexible in our approach is really important. We found as well that's what's really effective is focusing on the future and thinking about youth and education and connection to elders in the past has been really, really important for many of the nations and the communities we've worked with. And being able to think in a frame of reciprocity and equality has been really important as well, to think about moving beyond transactional relationships and really thinking about stewardship partnerships. And lastly, if I had one thing to mention to you all, that we all have a role to play in supporting Indigenous-led conservation. And by doing so, will lead to richer, more effective, and more meaningful conservation and restoration outcomes. And sometimes really just starts with just asking the question. And so key to that is building those relationships grounded in mutual respect. And I realize in some ways it isn't a big step to pick up the phone and call someone, but I also realize at the same time it's not necessarily easy, and it takes time and effort, and we need to recognize that and appreciate that, and work towards that. And you know, oftentimes I say that the easiest thing in the world to do is kind of have a cup of coffee with someone, but sometimes the hardest thing in the world to do is actually have a cup of coffee with someone. But recognize that each of us can do a lot, oftentimes in very small ways, sometimes in very big ways. But all of these will create lasting differences for the future of conservation and for all of our generations for today and tomorrow. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen, and we'll give probably a more relevant and interesting example as well too on some of the work that they've been doing around bison as well too.
Great, thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you to Caitlin and Carolyn and the rest of the organizers. It's been a really great conference so far. My computer seems to be lagging a little bit. So Carolyn, if you could just let me know if there's issues, and maybe if I shut my webcam off, that'll help. But just let me know if you're seeing issues. So my name is Kristen Martin, and I am part of the science team for the Saskatchewan region of the NCC. And like Nathan said, NCC is really in the early stages of trying to broaden our perspectives and our work to be more inclusive of Indigenous perspectives, and also to find some opportunities where we can work with and support Indigenous communities, towards working towards those shared conservation and restoration goals. And so for the Saskatchewan region, the first project where we really tried this approach was in the development of a management plan for the Plains bison herd that we manage down at the Old Man on His Back Prairie and Heritage Conservation Area. And so today I'm not going to talk too much about the plan itself, but more the process that we used for Indigenous engagement as part of this project. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Old Man on His Back is located in the southwest corner of the province. And it's just about 16 kilometers north of the Montana border. and it's in the mixed grasslands ecoregion of Saskatchewan. So it's a fairly big area. It's about 5,200 hectares or 13,000 acres of mostly native grasslands. And one of the things that we were told during the engagement process was that this area really is of high importance and significance for many different Indigenous nations, that it was included in the traditional territories of many different communities, but also that this area, as well as the Cypress Hills just north of it, was also and is also an important gathering place as well. So the area itself was inhabited and used for thousands and thousands of years by Indigenous people. And then, of course, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the area was settled by Europeans. And along with that, we saw the privatization of land and the displacement of those Indigenous communities that had used the area. So the Butala family settled on what is now Old Man on His Back. And fortunately, while much of the area, the surrounding area was being plowed up for crop production, the Butalas were really excellent stewards of the land, and they kept most of it in its native grassland state on which they grazed their cattle herds. And so the land passed through several generations of the Butala family, and the ranch grew, and finally ended up in the hands of Peter and Sharon Butala in the 70s. And so they ranched for a couple decades, and then once they were getting ready to retire in the 1990s, they approached NCC to see if we would take over the management of the ranch, because for them, it was their dream to see the ranch stay in its native grassland state in perpetuity. So in 1996, through a combination of lands that were purchased, some that were donated, and then also Crown leased land, NCC took over the management of what is now called Old Man on His Back Prairie and Heritage Conservation Area, which we refer to as OMB for short. So OMB is really an important area in terms of biodiversity, particularly grassland biodiversity. And because it is such a large, contiguous tract of native prairie, which as we know is becoming ever more rare in Saskatchewan, it really is an important place, especially for species at risk. I think at last count, we had documented 21 different federally listed species at risk that had in the past or currently use OMB. So it really is important in terms of biodiversity and the habitat that it provides for species at risk. So NCC has also reintroduced a species that has been missing from the grasslands at OMB for quite some time, and that is the plains bison. And bison lived on the plains of North America for thousands of years before they were almost eradicated in the late 1800s. And one of the main reasons that we put bison back out on the land there is that this was another one of Peter Butala's visions that he had for the land there. And so it was kind of a condition of NCC taking over the management of the land there. But of course, as an organization, NCC is trying as best as we can to replicate natural ecosystem processes on the lands that we manage. So it really was a natural fit for us as well to put back that key species and all of the ecosystem processes that bison bring to the grasslands. So after a lot of planning, the OMB Plains Bison Herd was established in 2003. And it started off with 50 calves who all came from Parks Canada's Elk Island National Park herd near Edmonton, Alberta. And so the bison herd continues to live at OMB today. In recent years, it's been maintained at around 75 to 85 adult animals. And the sale of calves, bison calves each year provides some revenue for NCC to continue its management at OMB. So in 2019, NCC initiated the process of developing a long-term management plan or strategy for the bison herd. And this was really to set out some goals and strategies around all aspects of herd management. So everything from managing for the health of the herd, managing for genetic diversity, what we wanted the herd to look like in terms of age structure and sex ratios and population size. And then also other aspects of management like handling and how we do roundup. And so given that Indigenous peoples and bison, lived on the prairies for thousands of years together, and that there really is a sacred relationship between Indigenous communities and bison, it really was essential, we thought, to make sure that our planning for the herd included those Indigenous perspectives on bison and how we should be managing the bison. And also thinking of it from a bit of a broader context, restoration of grassland ecosystems can include things like putting bison back on the landscape, or things like returning important processes like fire to the landscape. But we also need to think that, healthy grassland ecosystems also include and require the presence of Indigenous people on those lands and all the ways that they use the land as well. So we were also trying to see if we could identify some opportunities for NCC's management of OMB and the bison herd to support that, if we could as well. So the process that we used is that we brought together a group of Indigenous advisors who had various experience and expertise and knowledge about bison, who could participate in this project and in the development of the plan. And to do this, NCC hired Philip Brass, who is from Pipikasis First Nation. And he really took the lead on the project and, reached out to folks in the networks that he had connections to and who he thought whose voices really needed to be included on this project. And we really wanted to make sure that this happened early in the process. So this is something that we initiated before we even started writing the plan at all. It was kind of the very first step in the process. So one of the big things that we were looking for is to make sure that there was a lot of diversity in the group of advisors. So we had 13 advisors from 10 different First Nations, from Treaties 4, 6, and 7. So having that diversity in terms of the communities that people were from, the different linguistic groups, and then also diversity in terms of people's experience. So for example, we had artists in the group who focused their work on bison, people who worked in food sovereignty. We had elders with that ceremonial knowledge, and then also Indigenous bison keepers as well. So the very first meeting we had was in Regina, and this was just kind of a get to know everyone kind of meeting. we provided some information about the background of NCC, so talking about who we were and about Old Man on His Back and kind of what our goals were for the project. And so we had some initial discussions about bison and bison management as well. And this was kind of our very first attempt at this. And we definitely learned a few things that we took forward to the next meetings. One of the big things was about the meeting format. So we kind of approached the meeting from quite a typical Western approach, I would call it. So we had our agenda laid out with what we wanted to talk about at each time, and I think we put something like 15 minutes down at the beginning for introductions. And then by the time we had gone through the first roundtable there, I think introductions took all the way to lunchtime. So this is kind of a good example about how, we need to, as Nathan was saying, be flexible and give up some of that control, and you might have to kind of change the way that you're used to doing things. Another thing we learned is just about being aware of local protocols and expectations around compensation. So obviously, you need to compensate people well for the time and the expertise that they bring if they're, participating in a project like this. But the time that it takes to, get checks done up and written up in an organization is not always the same as, people having those checks right there at the meeting. So making sure that you know about that and can plan ahead. Another thing we learned about is really that ceremony is essential for this kind of work. And many people told us that, before we are even having these discussions, we need to be starting with ceremony. And another thing was that the importance about being present at the place that you're talking about. So we were talking about Old Man on His Back and talking about the bison, but we were sitting in a stuffy boardroom in Regina. And so you really need to be at the place you're talking about for those discussions to really be effective. And so we had a second meeting, and this was a gathering that we had out at Old Man on His Back for a weekend. And this was great. We had lots of opportunities to explore the native prairie. We got to go out and see the bison herd. We got to experience ceremony together. So we had a sweat lodge ceremony that everybody was invited to participate in. And, we shared in meals together, and there were lots of discussions, both in a formal setting where we were all sitting around the table talking, but also, more smaller discussions just between a couple people walking out on the prairie. And I think those types of conversations are really important in terms of building those relationships as well. So after those meetings, we took what we heard, and then we wrote up the bison management plan. And our intention was to have another gathering at Old Man on His Back in the spring of 2020, where we could, bring the plan back and discuss it with the group. But of course, with COVID, that didn't happen. So we ended up having an online meeting to talk about the plan and get some feedback, which is not the same and maybe not as effective as a gathering in person, but we still had some good discussions and got some good feedback on that. And so, like Nathan was talking about, the plan is done now, but we still have, we still want to work to to keep maintaining the relationships that we've begun with that group of advisors. And so some of the ways that we are planning to do that is having an annual gathering at OMB, similar to the one we had in 2019, where it's just a chance to get together, to share in meals together, to have ceremony, and hopefully once COVID dies down a little bit here, we will get to have that again, maybe this year, maybe next year. Another thing is providing buy-in to communities. So as part of our management, it often involves removing animals from the herd to meet those age structure goals or sex ratio goals. And so at Roundup every year, we usually have some animals that we are removing from the herd. And so for the past 2 years, we've been able to provide some opportunities for folks to come out and harvest a bison, or else we can harvest the bison and provide the meat to different communities. And we've also provided some animals to supplement some Indigenous bison herds elsewhere in the province. And then there were also a couple of communities who are looking to establish their own bison herds in the near future here. So working to support them in ways that we can, whether that's by providing animals as they start out their herd, or just sharing our plan, sharing the knowledge that we have come to know about what works for us in managing a herd like that. And so I'll just end here with some takeaways things that we really took away from this, but also might be helpful for other organizations who are looking to do this type of work. And Nathan kind of mentioned this as well, but this type of work really requires commitment, and it's requires resources and staff time. But I think you need to look at it as an investment, and it's definitely something valuable, and it's worth it to put in that time and those resources. I think having a well-connected advisor. So I think having Philip as part of the team to bring together that group of advisors was really important, and he had different connections and different networks of people, and I don't know if we would have been as successful without his guidance and his help in that area. Another thing we learned is the importance of being careful around the language that you use. So for example, not saying things like our advisory group or our lands, not being possessive, and also not talking about, Indigenous cultures and traditions as being things of the past, because they're very much relevant today. So not talking about those types of things only in a historical context. The importance of being transparent, and also being clear on the types of actions that you are able and willing to do. And so not just saying things that end up being empty promises, but really being clear about what your intentions are and what you're able to do. Just a few other things about the meetings themselves. We asked everyone for permission if we could record the meetings. So we had audio recordings, which we later transcribed. And so the recordings, the transcripts, and then any reports that we produced, we gave out to everybody in the group so that everybody had all of this access to everything that was said during the meetings. And that also allowed us to use some direct quotations, which I think really made the reports and the plan itself that much richer for having those. And then, yeah, just that online meetings are not always ideal. It's always better to be able to meet in person, but in COVID times, sometimes that is the way that you have to go. So I think that's it here. So yeah, Carolyn, I'll pass it back to you then.
That was great. Thank you so much, Nathan and Kristen, for the presentation. We have about 10 minutes for questions. And we will start here. Let me enable. Our first question is for Nathan, if I can find it. There's a lot of comments in the Q&A mode. Oh, here's the first one about the clam garden. Was your clam garden built in an estuary or a sheltered bay? And how did the boulder wall hold up under wave action?
Yeah, they're typically built, I'd say maybe in more sheltered areas, like kind of in protected coastal waters. Sometimes they're built in kind of an estuary areas where there's some source of fresh water. You don't see them a lot, I'd say, in really active high intensity wave environments, but there's lots of places where there's lots of current moving around, so there's still some wave action and things that are happening. And the walls themselves, you can imagine, are rocks, and so if they're maintained, they hold up actually really well. So the structures, these were built thousands of years ago, and we still see them. You can still tell what they are, and you can still see them today. But over the past 150 years or so, they've degraded over time due to sort of wave erosion and wave action. So the walls themselves may have shifted a bit, and that's what a lot of the restoration work is thinking about, moving those rocks back, clearing those beaches again. And we have, there's issues with increased climate change and wave action, and there's a lot of ferries in certain places that add wake problems that we need to deal with. But the nice thing about these is they are consistent of rocks, so once you get these places working, they do stand up fairly well to wave action.
Neat, thank you. Our next question is also from Shirley. So often collaboration can be one-sided. Nathan, how important would you say it is to learn what these Indigenous communities want from a stewardship relationship? And what experience have you had fulfilling those requests for reciprocity?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great point. I'd say oftentimes when we think about collaborative projects, and my time in Parks Canada, I've seen this, and I've been a part of these as well, whereby it's like we're doing a great project, why don't you come along and join? And that's either with Indigenous communities or local communities or other important stakeholders as well. And that oftentimes rubs people the wrong way, and I totally appreciate that. As neighbors and thinking about shared landscapes, and when we have connection to those places, we really want to be involved in those things, in those places, and what's happening there. So I'd say trying to figure out and trying to understand and learn from Indigenous communities in terms of what they want from a stewardship relationship is critical, and that really should define what your relationship looks like. It's not up to me or to others to say what that kind of looks like. And oftentimes what I find is successful is trying to find those places that we have common shared interests or common values on, and oftentimes as thinking about restoration or land-based actions, that's a very common place that we find a lot of opportunity to kind of work together. And oftentimes we may try to learn, and we may try to read, find out what we can, and then through further engagement, we'll learn more, and we'll be able to, nations will, and communities and individuals will start to trust us, and they'll start to share more. And then that's what we're learning. Flexible and adapting is really important for kind of an evolving and stewardship relationship that allows, over years, really you develop that, and then be able to, everyone has trust, and to be able to build that stewardship relationship in a way that kind of comes together as equals. So again, as Kristen was talking about as well, starting early, going in and working together and figuring out what those stewardship values are and how those can be part of the project and define the project is really important. And so in terms of fulfilling reciprocity, again, I think that goes back to hearing what are the values, what are the perspectives, and what are the needs and rights and responsibilities of the communities you're engaging in, what they are hoping to see happen on their traditional territories. And that's where we need to start, I think, thinking a little bit differently about sometimes how we can accomplish objectives. So in a lot of the projects I've been involved in as well, again, it's thinking about connections for elders and youth, barriers, accessing land, and just a lot of these places that we worked are islands, and boat transport and vessel transport is often super, super challenging. So when we think about reciprocity, we have to think about those type of barriers that sometimes get created and how can we kind of alleviate them or bring them, make things a little more easier, amenable, and support that. So, reciprocity for us is looked at like buying equipment, for instance, providing vessel transport, dealing with internal barriers to create opportunities for people to kind of be back on the land, be hunting and be engaging in those things that are really, really important to them. And reciprocity is an interesting thing because we provide that, be able to do that, and it comes back full circle. And a lot of those things that we do and those things that we support really pay off for a number of different ways for the organization, whether that's building that meaningful relationship and being able to kind of contribute to those conservation outcomes. So yeah, again, oftentimes it goes back to learning and listening from those communities and figuring out what the needs, challenges, and opportunities are, and thinking internally as an organization, how do you kind of be able to contribute to alleviating those barriers and providing those opportunities.
Great, thanks for that answer. The next question is for Kristen. Is the OMB herd free roaming, and have you noticed an increase in biodiversity since bison were reintroduced?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So the herd is not free roaming in the sense that it OMB is fenced. So it can't leave old man on his back, I guess. The summer pasture where the animals are in for about from April until the fall. It's about 6,000 acres in size, and then in the winter they're in a slightly smaller area. Is about 3,000 acres. So within those pastures, they are free roaming and can kind of go and be wherever they want. I don't know if this if we've really studied the biodiversity since the bison have been introduced. I'm not sure if that's something that has been done yet, but I know that we are continually assessing the range health and doing inventories and surveys of what species are using the area, and making sure that the bison are grazing in a way that is sustainable, and that's not overgrazing and not degrading the habitat at all.
Right. Thank you. The next question is, can you speak about NCC's commitment to providing access to properties for medicine, such as plants, or the collection of plants?
Yeah, I can mention it a bit. Maybe Kristen, you've got some input as well too to share. I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, like NCC is really thinking a lot about how it can support Indigenous conservation, Indigenous access to the land, and engaging with Indigenous people. And that's been thinking too about access for cultural resources, or to be able to engage in ceremony on the land as well too. And probably 5 years ago or so, that wasn't something that was really NCC thought a lot about. It was thinking about conservation and sort of the ecological values of the land. And so we're just kind of at those stages right now, we're right now actually talking very actively about this. And I'd say the organization really wants to be able to support, and has been supporting, Indigenous access to the land for medicines and other important things that are important to Indigenous communities and their cultural heritage. And we're taking steps now to kind of articulate that more clearly in our policy, and have that be a very important consideration for thinking about providing access and making access available. as well as, you know, thinking about restricting access to other users to be able to protect those cultural ceremony and that cultural heritage as well. So yeah, we're just, again, just working on developing that and forming that sort of policy direction for the organization. Kristen, I'm not sure if you guys have worked through some of that stuff in Saskatchewan or not, but
not yet. Like we're still at the talking about it kind of stage, I guess. But like one thing that came out of the advisory group meeting is that, you know, lots of Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan don't even know about NCC, and they don't know that we manage all of this land that, you know, can be accessed all over the province. So I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do to, you know, reaching out to communities and making sure that they even know about us and that what opportunities are there, but also, you know, having those discussions with communities and finding out what kind of access they're looking for and what kind of activities they want to be able to do on that land. And then going from there to really developing a strategy that works for everybody.
Great, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for questions this morning. There are a few that are left over, and maybe I can send them to Kristen and Nathan, and you can send the answers back and I can post them for the attendees. Great. So thanks again to Nathan and Kristen and Rennie and Sarah for their presentations today. They're all really great. And that marks the end of our planning part 1 session. Thanks for joining us this morning. Next on our schedule is the trade show, the poster session, and discussion groups. We have 2 planned discussion groups, one about boots on the ground and another case study led by Chris Tenzin from Trace Associates. So we hope to see you over there. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.